Picture a world where you suddenly became invisible to everyone around you. That's exactly the fate this guy faced when he awoke to find himself a ghost. Now he's on a mission to uncover what happened to him and figure out how to reach the living. The story kicks off with a group gathered around a dinner table outside a home. They're raising a toast to Nick. Nick's mom delivers a heartfelt speech, noting that his dad's running late as usual. Nick rises from his seat and steps away from the celebration. He heads over to slice a cake decorated with his own likeness, then enters the house, perches on a stool, and aims a gun at his head. Right before pulling the trigger, he snaps awake. It was all just a nightmare. Now he's sitting at breakfast with his mom, staring at a goofy smiley face meal. Pretty childish for an adult. He brings up a writing course in London he's eager to join, asking if she's given it any thought. Her expression suggests she's not thrilled about the idea. So he playfully flips the smile on his plate into a frown. Adorable, right? Next, he's pedaling off to school on his bike. At school, we catch him making a quick deal. He's handing over homework he did for another kid. After passing it off, his girlfriend surprises him from behind, wondering if he'll show up to a party tomorrow night. He brushes it off, saying he's got plans. Then we see a trio, two guys and a girl, cornering this other dude for cash he owes. Looks like he's in debt to them. Annie, the group's ringleader, pulls a knife and menaces him, though she only nicks his finger with a light scratch. Now we're in Nick's classroom, where some kids reciting his homework aloud. The teacher challenges Nick to outshine it. Nick strolls to the front, hops onto the desk, and shares his own piece. His poetry's solid, but the class looks bored stiff. The bell rings, and they all scramble out with their bag. Now the students are chilling in the cafeteria. The scratched-up kid turns out to be Pete, Nick's closest buddy. Nick's urging Pete to grow a spine and stop letting people walk all over him. Pete admits he's too scared to fight back, so Nick steps up to handle it for him. He confronts the trio, settles Pete's debt, and leans in to whisper to Annie, "You're such a mess." He seriously thought he'd walk away unscathed after that, but Annie pauses for a beat before pouncing, landing a few solid hits to his face. Now they're both stuck waiting outside the principal's office, sharing a tense chat. She snaps that he's no saint either, pointing out his essay-selling gig. He owns up to being a hypocrite, and then the principal steps in, dismissing Annie. Turning to Nick, he warns him to stop wasting energy on hopeless cases like Annie Newton. "She's got no prospects," he says. "You've got a future. Don't disappoint us." Nick's only response is a flat, "Can I go now, please?" And just like that, we cut to Annie at home. Her stepmom hasn't bothered feeding her little brother, so she calls her out on it. This sparks a shouting match between her dad and stepmom, but Annie just heads upstairs to whip up a sandwich for her brother, Victor. Victor asks if she's heading out tonight, and she nods yes. You can see his face drop instantly. Back at Nick's place, Pete swings by and ribs him about getting thrashed by a girl. "Been there, huh?" Pete brings up that party again, but Nick says he won't even be in town tomorrow. He's jetting off to London for that writing program. His mom's clueless about it, but he's going regardless. He gripes that she's always trying to control his every move. He's got everything figured out, and this time, she's not calling the shots. Now Annie hops into a car with her boyfriend, Marcus, and they speed off to hit up a jewelry shop. Annie smashes the display, snags some bling, dashes back to the stolen Mercedes Marcus nabbed, and they peel out. The next morning, Annie's getting ready for school, bag in tow. Marcus tells her to ditch the bag with him, but she shuts him down, daring him to try something. And, oh, he does. He grabs his phone and dials the cops. What a snitch. At school, Annie stashes the bag in her locker. As she shuts it, she catches Pete glaring at her from across the hall. Minutes later, the police roll up, crack open her locker, find the stolen goods, and haul her off. From the station, she phones Marcus with the news. He asks if she's got any guesses about who tipped them off, and she says she's got a hunch and will handle it. Are you sure about that? Anyway, post-call, she storms out of the station, hell-bent on payback against the one she's convinced betrayed her. Cut to Pete bidding Nick farewell. They share a hug, and Nick heads home, where his mom's found out about his London ticket. The airline called about a schedule change, spilling the beans. She grills him about it. He mumbles an apology, claiming he meant to discuss it with her, but she points out he's had the ticket for weeks, proof he was set on going no matter her opinion. She's stunned he'd planned to vanish without a word. "It's like I've been sharing a house with a stranger," she says. Nick's up in his room, packing to leave. He slips a watch into his pocket. Then we see Pete hurrying along at a fast clip, and wham! Some dude blindsides him with a punch out of nowhere. It's Annie's crew. They drag him to her. She's dead sure he's the one who snitched, so she's pounding him, demanding he confess to something he didn't do. The beating's too much for him to take, so he caves and says he'll name the real culprit. Who's he about to throw under the bus now? his best pal, Nick. But hear him out. He's got his reasons. He's not a total backstabber or anything. He figured Nick would have already skipped town for London by now, leaving Annie with no one to target. Too bad for all of them. Nick's flight got pushed back, so he's at the party, asking his girlfriend if she'd like to tag along to London. While they're chatting, he tosses her the ticket, telling her to enjoy herself. Seems his mom's words hit home, and he's ditched the London plan, and that spells trouble for everyone involved. He's strolling home when a car starts tailing him, then forces him into a ditch. It's Annie and her posse. They're laying into it now. Pete stumbles out of the car, trying to justify himself, but no one's paying attention. Annie hauls Nick up and demands, "Who's the broken one now?" He fires back, "Still you. Gotta admire a guy with guts, right? Okay, maybe that didn't come out quite right." Anyway, Nick's bravado earns him a few more punches and a brutal kick to the head. That kick does him in, and they dump his body into a pit. As they do, Nick's watch slips off, but it goes unnoticed. I could let Pete off the hook earlier, but not anymore. How do you let yourself get tangled up in this? He's your best friend, for heaven's sake. Anyway, Annie heads home and spills everything to Marcus. She brags about taking out the guy who snitched on her, and Marcus's face betrays his shock. He knows full well Nick wasn't the rat. He questions why she came to us. "You know I'm on parole, Annie," he snaps, shoving her out. She feels stabbed in the back. Betrayed, huh? Oh, just wait until she learns he's the one who turned her in. She trashes some stuff in his workshop, plants a mocking kiss on him, and storms off. The next morning rolls around, and she's torching last night's clothes. You won't guess what's coming next. Nick? He emerges from the woods, looking untouched, so pristine and sharp. He strolls to school, plops down in class. But here's the kicker. No one notices. He's, what's the word? Unseen. Totally relatable. So he's there in class, but no one knows it, even though he's right in the thick of it. Hearing every word, they seize the chance to vent about him, including his girlfriend. She labels him a show-off, always chasing some sense of superiority. You can't rely on these girls, dude. Then again, his best friend sold him out, too. So really, trust no one, man. At first, he assumes they're just messing with him, but then he grabs a book, hurls it at the shelf, and it doesn't even budge. Nada. He races to the principal's office phone to ring his mom. He's inches from the principal's nose, but the guy doesn't flinch. Is this dude John Cena? Or what? He yells for his mom. He overhears her chatting with detectives about him, but his voice doesn't reach her. He bolts home. Along the way, he crashes into someone in the school corridor, gets clipped by a car, smashed by a truck, but none of it leaves a mark in reality. He reaches home to find detectives swarming the place, hunting for clues. He tries to ease his mom's pain by shouting that he's gone, but naturally, she hears nothing. Now he's just drifting through the streets. Man, if I realized I was invisible, I'd be up to way more than just wandering around aimlessly. Anyhow, detectives Brian and Kate are digging deeper. They're making progress in their search. The principal tells them about Nick's scuffle with Annie, so they head to her place. Turns out, Brian knew Annie as a kid. Her dad was a cop back then. They're up on her roof, grilling her about her whereabouts last night, while Nick hovers nearby, watching her dodge the truth. He also learns she took him out, thinking he'd ratted her out. He tries shoving her off the roof, but, well, that's a no-go. The detectives lead a team to the woods where Nick's body was stashed, and Annie calls Pete, telling him to show up there. Nick overhears, and he looks like he's about to puke. Back in his room, he watches his mom sift through his thing. She picks up a poem he wrote, and he recites it alongside her silently. His pet bird joins him in this unseen realm. He cradles it in his palms, and moments later, it vanishes. That clicks something in his head. He mutters, "I'm not dead," and sprints to the spot where his body lies. He's desperate to guide the search team to him, but the people aren't picking up his signals. The dog, though, for a second, it seems to spot him, but then it looks away at the last moment. Still, the pup sniffs out Nick's watch, so there's that. Meanwhile, Pete's filling Annie and the crew in. He's worried they're about to get busted, so he says he'll turn himself in to the cops. Annie warns him if he talks, he's locking himself up too. All this time, Nick's right there, taking it all in. Annie sneaks back into her house, stuffing a bag with her belongings bolt. Victor stirs awake, asking if she's leaving for good, like their mom did. Ouch, that hits hard. Tears well up in Annie's eyes. She may be tough as nails, but she melts for this kid. She tells Victor never to turn out like her. Solid advice. Her dad barges in and orders her out, and she's like, fine, but warns if anything happens to Victor, she'll return and take him down. She bolts from the house, and Nick launches into another monologue, telling her that her messed up home life doesn't justify a thing she's done. The search in the woods ramps up. Helicopters and ambulances join the scene. An expert warns if Nick's still out there alive, he's got 2 or 3 days max. We get a glimpse of Nick's body. His fingers twitch faintly. He's hanging on. Detective Brian swings by to chat with Marcus. He asks if Marcus was with Annie on Tuesday night. Yep, he says he was. What about the night before, during the jewelry heist? Nah, Marcus claims. He's clueless about that. Sure he is. Naturally, Brian's aware Marcus has been on parole for 8 months, but he doesn't push it. He just slides him a card, saying to call if Annie shows up. He needs a word with her about a kid missing from her school. Before leaving, Brian casually mentions he knows the exact make of the car swiped the night of the robbery. Nick's now pleading with his mom, saying this won't shake her. She's always got everything locked down. He's yelling, shaking her, tossing stuff off her desk, even chucking a chair at the window. But of course, none of it actually happens. Soon after, his mom collapses, sobbing and calling out for him. Pete's out walking in the rain when Marcus ambushes, jamming a gun into his chest. Marcus says the cops are tailing, and they are. He drags Pete into the woods, and Pete points out the dump spot. Next day, Marcus tries luring Annie to a spot to take her out, but she smells a trap, so she sends Pete in her place. Pete heads out, with Detective Kate shadowing him, thanks to Nick's frantic efforts to alert her. Pete meets the crew at a bridge, while Annie watches from afar, until Marcus sneaks up behind her, gun pressed to her spine. He marches her to the bridge with the others, then tells Pete to scram. Pete bolts, gratitude all over his face. Marcus says they've got to move fast. Pete's got a tail and he's spot on, but it's too late. The cops swarm in. Annie snatches a shotgun from Marcus, aiming it at the police, but they're boxed in. Still, Annie's a fighter. She scrambles free and makes a break for it. Spider-Man would tip his hat to that escape. As she flees, Nick hollers, "They'll nab you, Annie," and it's like she catches his voice. She spins around and shouts back. Nick's stunned. "She heard me!" She ducks into a club, hawks a ring of Marcus's to some dude, and after pocketing the cash, sticks around to dance. She peels off her hoodie and cap, busting out that classic awkward sway, while Nick just stands there, observing. Come morning, she visits her mom's grave, whispering an apology. Nick pipes up, musing how he sometimes wished his mom had died instead of his dad. All that pressure she heaps on him. He reaches out, resting a hand on Annie's shoulder, insisting she can hear him, begging her to tell them where his body's at, but she just stands and walks off. He trails her. She breaks into the school after dark, stuffs cash into an envelope for Victor, and tucks it to her locker. Nick's there, telling her he's fading fast. Time's running out. Ironically, she's his only shot at survival. You can tell his voice is echoing in her mind. He bellows her name, and she whips around, but sees no one. She's wrecked now. She hits the showers, and being the gentleman he is, Nick keeps his eyes averted. Meanwhile, the real Nick, down in the hole, cracks his eyes open. Annie's crashed out on the basketball court. Nick's right beside her, tracing his fingers over her, murmuring her name. He dozes off, only to be jolted awake by the basketball team rolling in for practice. How's a ghost catching Z's anyway? Whatever. Now Annie's in Nick's house, flipping through old pics, lost in memories. Please don't tell me these two are catching feelings. Nick's even grinning while his body rots in a ditch. Lucky for us, Nick's mom barges in and snuffs out any budding romance. Annie bolts from the house, racing straight to the woods, to the spot they dumped Nick. And, surprise, the body's gone. Nick's telling her someone moved him, urging her to think hard. She spots clues, stuff she saw with Pete earlier, and it clicks. Pete was here. She tracks him down at school. Pete spills that Nick didn't even snitch, then admits he and Marcus relocated the body. So she goes after Marcus. She jumps him in his car, right outside a police station no less, then drags him to a cliff, ordering him to kneel. Talk about a power flip. She levels a gun at him. Meanwhile, Pete's trying to check out for good. Nick's pleading with him to stop, but Pete's deaf to it. Here's the wild part. In that limbo mode, not quite dead, but not alive, Pete locks eyes with Nick. They can see and hear each other. Nick's asking where they stashed his body. Same question Annie's putting to Marcus. They both cough up answers at once. Right then, Pete's parents burst in, finding him mid-collapse, and Annie leaves Marcus behind, turning to hunt for Nick. Letting Marcus live? Big mistake? He gets up, shoots her, but she's still kicking. She fires back, then staggers up and calls Detective Bryant, telling him Nick's location, plus the stash for Victor in her locker. Make sure he gets it. Cops race to the dam, where Nick's body's at, but Ghost Nick beats them there. He finds himself reaching out, but he's powerless to help. The dam gates open. Nick's drowning. Kate yells to shut the gates. Cops scour the water. Bryant spots him. They swarm in. He's alive. They load him into an ambulance. Annie watches from a distance, bleeding out. She climbs into her car, passes out for a bit, wakes up to a cop tapping her window, telling her to step out. She floors it instead. Cue the chase. At the hospital, Nick's mom's watching the docs fight for him. Cops corner Annie, guns drawn, but Nick's voice cuts through her head. I need you, Annie. I need you. That's all she guns the engine, blasting through the barricade, ditches the car, and finishes on foot. Destination? The hospital, obviously. Nick guides her to his operating room. She arrives, and his mom snaps, "You've got guts showing up here." Nick tries to calm things, but, she can't hear him. Annie's on her own. She says she just needs to speak to Nick, and his mom slaps her hard. Annie insists Nick's here. She feels him, hears him, knows what he wants, but mom's not buying it. On Nick's cue, Annie recalls that time she read his poems in his room. He was there with her. Mom demands what she's after. Annie says she just needs to see him. I can help him. Mom shuts it down, so Annie hands over her gun, swearing she can bring him back. Finally, she's let in. Annie's running her hands over Nick's body, apologizing, begging him to stay. She slips off her mom's old necklace, presses it into his palm, climbs onto the bed, curling up beside him. The second she does, ghost. Nick vanishes. Real Nick gasps awake, croaking out, "Annie?" She says she wanted to do one decent thing. He tells her she did. She saved it. Then Annie fades out. Later, Victor's playing with a toy plane. Nick rolls up, chats with him. Victor says his sister's gone. Nick suggests they send her a note. Victor keeps it short. "Hey, Annie." Nick scribbles it on the plane. They launch it skyward. Lesson here? Beats me. But dang, that was heavy.